Hello, and welcome to the Stereotypical Scotsman. And today's going to be a wee bit different. Now, today is about a true blue Australian legend. And in case you haven't noticed, I'm not Australian. So I'm going to hand the reins over to one of the biggest Aussie icons of the century.
There once was a jolly swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree, and he sang as he watched and waited till his billy boiled. You'll come a waltzing Matilda with me.
Oh, crikey. Must have been a bloody big row. G'day, and welcome to the Audacious Aussie. I'm Steve Dundee. And today, I'm going to be tracking a much more dangerous and volatile creature than your everyday saltwater croc. Today, I'm going to be tracking the legendary achievements of Australian bush poet Banjo Paterson. Banjo wasn't his real name. I mean, what self-respecting parent would call their kid Banjo? It's like calling your kid double bass or trombone. Anyway, his real name was Andrew Barton Paterson. Or Drew to his friends. Drew grew up in pretty regular conditions of that of a middle-class family. He finished school at the age of 16. After school, Drew was apprenticed into a Sydney firm of solicitors called Spain and Solway, which sounded suspiciously like a type of country and Mexican dip. He was admitted as a solicitor in 1886 and formed a legal partnership, Street and Paterson. During these years, he decided being a solicitor wasn't very interesting. So he started up a small side job, publishing poetry and prose in Australian newspapers of the time. It was also at this time that he decided Andrew was a pretty crap name. And so the banjo was born. At the age of 32, he had accomplished two great milestones in Australian literary history. The first, he composed one of the most famous Aussie tunes in the book to date, Waltzing Matilda. And the second, he officially published his first book, The Man from Snowy River. The quality of Banjo's poems and songs was of such a high standard that even today, 100 years in the future, are still being printed and reprinted. And granted, it may not make it to your iPod, but Waltzing Matilda is the best known Aussie song to date. In 1988, Banjo travelled to South Africa as a war correspondent on the Boer War for the Sydney Morning Herald, and to China 2 years later to cover the Boxer Rebellion. Unfortunately, Banjo was a little late. By the time he arrived in China, the Boxers had gotten tired and gone home for some sangers and beer. This is one of the spots Banjo used to come to escape the humdrum of being a solicitor. Incidentally, this is also the spot in which the legend of the drop bear originated. That, however, is just a myth used to scare tourists away from this sacred spot. Drop bear! Drop bear! By 1902, Banjo had finally admitted to himself that the legal profession sucked. So he quit being a lawyer and was appointed editor of the Sydney Evening News the following year. The reason Banjo was known as the bush poet of legend was because of the settings which inspired much of his work. This was Banjo's studio. He was a man of the land. Much like myself, he was completely at home here with the plants and the animals. He feared nothing. Snake! By 1903, Banjo had decided it wasn't much fun being a bush bachelor. He was tired of not having a lover. Well, except for old Righty, of course. So he settled down with young Sheila by the name of Alice Walker. And in 1904 and 1906, Banjo made two pretty different contributions to Australian society. Like any true Aussie, Banjo was very protective when it came to his family. Just like this little guy, the Australian emu. This little guy's only a baby, so he's not old enough to pose any real threat. Uh-oh, it's calling its mother. Quickly, run! In World War I, Banjo decided he wanted to be a war correspondent, so he rocked up to Europe, hoping that a position had opened up, but instead found himself driving an ambulance around France. After the war, Banjo returned to Australia and his old profession, journalism. Eventually he became too old to care about work, and so in 1930, Banjo retired. And in 1939, Banjo was made commander of the Order of the British Empire. Banjo eventually decided to retire from everything altogether. And so, on the 5th of February, 1941, Banjo Andrew Barton Paterson died. However, before his death, Banjo had built a highly secure reputation for himself that would see him immortalised as the legendary folk poet of Australia. His legacy includes 7 volumes of poetry in prose in hundreds of editions, the collected verse of A.B. Patterson, a children's book titled The Animals Noah Forgot, also informally known as Why the Dinosaurs Are Dead, an anthology, The Old Bush Songs, in addition to hundreds of pieces of journalism and 3 very dirty ditties. All in all, Banjo Paterson really was more than met the eye. He was a lawyer, a journalist, a reporter, a bachelor, a father, a husband, a war hero, an ambulance driver, a poet, and a composer. Some would call him a polymath, but me, I call him a true blue Aussie. So I guess this concludes this episode of the Audacious Aussie. But before I go, I would just like to say, that's not a knife. That's a knife. Oh, crikey! Look at this gorgeous stingray! Come on, little fella. You look harmless enough.
Down came a jumbuck to drink at the Billabong.
Bugger it. I'll be a solicitor.
Him with glee, and he sang as he stowed that jumbuck in his tucker bag. You'll come a waltzing Matilda.